Hi, everyone. Arsalan Arif here with Endpoints News, and thanks for joining us today for Hungry for Knowledge, Set the Table for HCP and Patient Engagement. I'm excited to moderate today's expert panel, and we're going to discuss the changing way HCPs and patients consume information and how this drives the evolution of omni-channel and omni-format engagement. We're sponsored by Carger Publishers, a globally active medical scientific publisher whose purpose it is to connect and advance health sciences. Joining us, we have Iola Forster. Iola leads the industry team at Carger Publishers and has a proven track record of developing customized global publishing projects for pharma, biotech, and medtech industries, as well as successful omni-channel and omni-format approaches for reaching communities in the healthcare ecosystems. Jonathan Gifford is Carger's manager of healthcare publication development. Working closely with pharma and biotech sponsors, his main priority is the creation of accessible, digestible, and independent medical education for both clinical and patient audiences. And Neil Adams is a certified medical publication professional who works with Carger's pharma, biotech, and medical device partners to communicate company-sponsored research and disease state education to both HCPs as well as patients. Finally, we have Todd Parker. He's a senior VP and managing director of MedThink SciComm and has extensive medical affairs experience with a focus on scientific strategy. He is currently a member of the MAPS Medical Communications Working Group and previously served as chairperson for the ISMPP Board of Trustees. If you have any questions during today's webinar, our panelists have reserved some time for questions. Just hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as soon as you think of the question. This webinar will be available on demand tomorrow to rewatch or to share it with your colleagues. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Iola to get us started. Iola?
Thank you, Arsalan, and thanks to the audience for joining us today. So our aim for today is to provide you with some insights that can be useful when formulating engagement strategies for either healthcare professionals or patients. This webinar will be structured into 3 modules. We will start with the importance of having a deep understanding of healthcare communities and the use of an omni-format approach to bridge knowledge gaps, continuing with the need to translate complex medical terminology into plain, understandable, and digestible language, and ending with some examples on how to leverage a combination of communication channels and formats to reach your intended audience if you want to effectively communicate health information. So, without further ado, let's dive in. As learners, we all have our own unique learning patterns. Right, so there are different types, as you can see here from the slide, of learners. Right, there are people that prefer to read, others prefer to consume information by watching or listening, and there are even others that prefer to learn by discussing in a group. And finally, another very important type is the kinesthetic type. Kinesthetic means experience-based learning. So this is the type of person that learns by experiencing or doing something him or herself. These patterns, however, can change throughout the day. Right? So let's take an example. I am a reading type, for instance. But after a long day in front of a screen, I may prefer to listen to a podcast at the end of the day. So that said, in order to effectively reach a broader audience, it is beneficial to provide content in various formats that cater to different learning and consumption preferences and situations. This approach can facilitate enhanced information consumption and retention, so ultimately leading to a more comprehensive understanding of the subject matter. And with that, Neil, Would you be able to illustrate how understanding those changing consumption preferences drives the format chosen for communication information, maybe using an HCP, for instance, as a point in case?
Sure. Thanks, Yola. So if we look at, for example, a cancer specialist who's maybe 35 years old, has been working for 4 to 5 years, works a lot of overtime, and we learn that she has a special interest in artificial intelligence. We also learn that she likes to socialize with family and friends and loves to travel when her busy schedule allows. This is just, through interaction, work with this particular HCP, we learn these sort of personal descriptors. Because she's relatively young and likes to travel, digital formats, for example, videos or podcasts, might be preferred over print. She's very busy, as we said, so bite-sized content, digestible content is likely to be preferred over lengthy resources. And she's tech savvy, as I mentioned, the artificial intelligence. So when it comes to a visual, for example, 3D images might really have a particular appeal for this cancer specialist. But as we know, all cancer specialists are not like our example. Older physicians may prefer print over digital. Some may have more time for a deep dive into the details of a resource, and therefore may avoid the bite-sized content. You can see the differences between the two. Certainly, if you're working on a global engagement campaign, you need to take into consideration consumption habits within different countries. For example, we know that HCPs in North America consume more printed content overall than their counterparts in Europe or in Asia. The point is, consumption habits of HCPs vary widely depending on their age and their experience, their professional, and yes, even their personal lives. Also, not to forget, even the time of day is important, as Yola mentioned earlier. For example, when it's time to go home after a long day, whether by a subway, a car, or a bike, a podcast really might be a very effective way at communicating the latest research or providing education about a particular disease state. So that's HCPs. What about content consumption habits of patients? Here again, those of us at Karger working in this space have learned over the years that content consumption habits among patients vary depending on several factors. Their particular disease, the work of patient advocacy groups that they follow, where they live geographically, just some examples. Overall, research has shown that the most common driver for YouTube engagements are patient education videos. But I think we're going to hear more about patient education in a little bit. Just for this segment, Yola, I just want to say in the end, an omni-format approach to both HCP and patient engagement is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I totally agree, Neil. Thank you for this insights and sharing your thoughts on that. I want to hand over to Todd and ask you, Todd, about your view on that.
So, as I was listening to Neil, he mentioned consumption habits varying. He mentioned podcasts, and it just kind of jumped out at me as a case in my own family. I am very partial to podcasts. I love to listen as I'm driving, to get information as I go. My family does not have that passion or love. They differ. They don't like to listen to podcasts in the car. They want to hear music. So even just thinking about consumption habits, not across countries, but on an individual level, it's very different. And I think that's where we have to start. We have to start with understanding our audiences. So it all begins with who. Who are you trying to reach? What are you trying to communicate? What's the medical goals, communication points that you're trying to reach? And then once you know those, you can progress into the how question. But it all starts with understanding the audience's channel and format preferences. What are their pain points? And how do you create a journey map that identifies the educational needs as specific decision points so that when they're seeking that information, they can find what they're looking for, what they need, where they are going, and in the format they prefer. Now, how we get that information varies. In pharma, you're usually leveraging internal stakeholders. There's field medical or med info, medical directors. There's a wide range of team members who have significant audience insights. But in addition, there's the syndicated data that provides a lot of answers to where they're going and what they're seeking. Finally, you can use primary research as needed to fill in any gaps. What do I need to understand that's missing? And on this slide here, this is a distillation of a lot of other types of information focusing specifically on channel and format preferences, but it starts to look down, what are those foundational content sources to which they're going, but also keeps in mind that they're heavily using, in this case, certain social platforms, not just the open ones, but also those closed physician communities like Doximity. So if we know where they're going, how do we make sure we give them the content we need and direct them back to those foundational, the journals, the articles, the other content that we're developing?
Yeah, very, very good points, Todd. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that as well. So I think we can just summarize that understanding the consumption habits and preferences of both HCPs and patients is critical for effective engagement, and an omni-format approach that considers factors like age, experience, personal and professional lives, or geographic location, and time of day is necessary to tailor communication effectively. In addition to format, though, I think it's also essential to consider the language and terminology used to convey that information, ensuring that complex medical terms are translated into plain, understandable, and digestible language that patients, but also healthcare professionals can easily comprehend. This approach, in my opinion, not only improves knowledge transfer, but also enhances patient outcomes in the end, and empowers individuals to make informed decisions about their health. So maybe Todd, coming back to you, would you mind sharing your perspective on that matter as well?
So one of my colleagues had made a point many years ago, and it's always stuck with me, and it's looking at how do people look for information. People like to be able to quickly find what they need, and all too often we forget that doctors are people too. And there was a digital ethnography study shared at the 2023 ISMAP meeting a couple of weeks ago, and they were looking at installing, there were apps based on the physicians' computers, around 276 physicians, and it was looking for their patterns of how they seek information during the day. True insights into this is what I am doing. And with that, they saw that the HCPs were not interacting with medical publications for a very extensive period of time. It was usually about less than 2 minutes. It's almost like a foraging behavior. They're quickly reviewing and scanning, looking at the overall story to find what is that information I need, and then digging deeper where necessary. And that's where we have to be thinking about the range of options available to us to make our content more accessible to our audiences. And we've seen a real landscape change over the last 5 to 10 years. We moved from text-based PLSs to infographics. PLSPs a wide range of options to consider how we can enhance the accessibility of the content. That's our goal. That's what we're doing, is to make sure people understand the information we're doing, and are we investing in the time and resources needed to do so. But what I really also love is the tremendous shift towards patient-focused content. And I know this is something, Johnny, you were sharing a lot of insights about this last week. I would love for you to share a little bit more about what you're doing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Todd. Well, you know, just to provide a bit of context, until the mid-20th century, healthcare professionals really dominated the decision-making process. But as we all know, since then, the relationship between physicians and patients has transitioned to something more like a partnership. Patients are now considered active participants in their health. Equally, patients should be active participants in creating relevant and digestible disease state patient education. Easy to understand infographics that match patient learning styles are critical to engaging patients and helping them understand that information immediately. I mean, my own experiences have shown that sometimes patients can feel somewhat overwhelmed by the information provided about their condition or their disease. And it's all about how to present that information in a simple, effective, and perhaps less scary manner. Working with relevant patient advocacy groups to present complex topics in a simpler way is central to providing effective and engaging patient content and improving patient health literacy. When patients don't have a high health literacy or the ability to understand, engage, and act upon health information, and which patient education seeks to boost, there can be negative health consequences. So we must stress the importance of using real-life patients to help review or even create the content of an infographic, let's say, to help contextualize a disease state in an easy to understand format, helping better understand their condition, or focusing on a specific element, such as a call to action. Maybe the importance of early detection and screening, for example.
I agree. Thank you, Todd and Johnny. Again, very interesting insights. So I think again we can conclude that the field of healthcare, right, is constantly evolving to enhance accessibility and also understanding of medical content with a specific focus on engaging patients and improving their health literacy to achieve better health outcomes. And at this point, I may want to invite the audience, please, to post any questions into the chat. If you have any, we will be happy to come back to those at the end of the webinar. And now moving on into the next topic, if you will. As I said, it's all about improving patient outcomes, right? Engaging patients, improving health literacy, and building up on that idea. One can say or suggest that an engagement strategy can be applied, right? So usually everything starts with a single piece of research, if you will, that is normally published in a peer-reviewed publication to get accredited and acknowledged. This piece of research can be considered as a seed that you plant, for instance, and that then can be grown into much more. So it's essential to keep in mind that not everyone can understand highly scientific information, right, as we said, due to differences in education or background. And to grow that seed, the information can be translated into patient language or an easy to understand language for HCPs, such as a summary. Additionally, animations, videos, or audio interviews with authors can enhance the audience's experience. So an engagement strategy thus involves communication extensions and communication enhancements to make the topic accessible in multiple formats and channels, drawing the audience into the subject. And to share an example, I'd like to show this a slide and say a few words. So this actually illustrates how a customer of ours from a pharma company approached us with a request to accelerate the knowledge transfer to remote areas of the world after a significant oncology conference. So to achieve this, we not only produced various formats of the information, but we also tactically organized them. So we started by creating a scientific summary sheet while concurrently working on a peer-reviewed paper. The paper was published later on in the relevant disease awareness month, because as some of you may know, a peer review of course requires time and needs to be, this time needs to be accounted for. So again, a summary sheet right at the beginning to have that information out very quickly while working on the full peer-reviewed paper that was published in a disease awareness month. And that was accompanied by podcast interviews with authors, along with an interview with a patient sharing their perspective as well. And we repeated the same process for the European conference, where we even recorded on-site interviews with experts. And additionally, we created a dedicated landing page for the content and implemented an audience generation campaign through social media channels. The approach resulted in about 1 million impressions within 2 weeks, which I think nicely illustrates the potential of a targeted engagement strategy and what can be accomplished with a tactical plan that is implemented. And yeah, with that, I'd like to hand over to you, Jonathan, maybe to share an example of a rare disease awareness suite that we've developed recently. So over to you.
Oh, thank you, Yola. Yeah, so, you know, I previously mentioned the importance of patient involvement in the creation of patient education. And nowadays, we are witnessing an increase in active involvement of patients as educators, right, in order to better understand patient learning styles. This could include the psychosocial aspects of health and the promotion of patient-centered care by including the voices of those who are experts by experience, right? You know, we discussed infographics. However, for the best learning outcomes, and I think, you know, this could even, I'm talking about patients now, this could even be relevant to one of the questions that's just come through in the Q&A. You know, we're talking about combining different methods, you know, whether that's a patient, an HCP who works as a neurologist or a hematologist, you know, we're combining these different methods that cater to people with various learning styles, whether they're a patient or a healthcare professional. And this is what we call the omni-format approach. What you can see here on the screen, we're a suite, if you like, of patient resources on the topic of Waldenstrom macroglobulinemia, let's call it WM to save time. And these were developed in conjunction with two key advocacy groups, the IWMF and WMUK from the US and from the UK respectively. And they encompass the importance of omni-format resources to aid in that individual's, in this case a patient's, deeper understanding of their disease, as well as gaining a wider, more engaged audience. So these were distributed at patient events physically and digitally via newsletters and online learning hubs, a series of videos, podcasts, infographics, and a bit of a larger, more in-depth booklet, all developed, by the way, with the input of real-life patients, catered to all these learning styles. And moreover, and I think this is the real takeaway, made patients feel heard and valued.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Todd, I'd like to give the word to you as well. So would appreciate if you maybe would share some of your experiences in a real life case, maybe.
Sure. So as an agency, specific examples are a little more confidential, which limits what I can share. But what I can say is every company's at a different place and has their own approach and needs for how we build a customized plan. I think it's looking for those that may be earlier in their, I hate to use the word journey since I've already used that repeatedly for other purposes, but as they're beginning to establish omni-channel planning, they may want to be starting with looking at, let's look at the channel and format preferences of our audience and use that to inform tactical recommendations that will help accomplish our medical objectives. But for those that are a more advanced place, they may want to delve into the audience insights and begin segmenting audiences to create specific omni-channel journeys for their key communication points. And that's an important element. For each product, you're probably going to have multiple communication points. It may be something related to AE management. There's a unique adverse event for which information is needed by the audiences. It may be the elevation of real world data. How you leverage the channels and formats available to you will vary because those are two very different topics. And in one case, maybe you're trying to reach AE management with oncology nurses. Where they're going is going to be different. The types of formats that they want is going to be different. There's a question in the chat about differences in basically the audiences. Yes, there's major differences when you're looking from oncologists to dermatologists, when you're looking at neurologists. Where they're going varies, what they're looking for varies. Some specialties are more geared towards videos. They love to see actual putting into practice what we're talking about. So you really need to understand your audiences and figure out, well, it's not just an audience. Within that, there's potential segments. Maybe it's community oncologists versus OLs, different needs, different learning styles and preferences. We need to be aware of those things to make sure that we're putting our content where it's going to be seen. This is our role to make sure that we get the information out to our audiences, and it requires us investing time and effort to make sure that we've thought through that effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Thank you, Todd. Very much appreciated. So in closing, maybe we've talked about omni-format a lot now. Maybe Neil, can I ask you to kind of summarize why it is important to consider an omni-format approach?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, as Todd just indicated, an omni-format approach is absolutely essential to consider because your scientific communication plan really doesn't work without it. It's all about making information more accessible and digestible, communicating the information, which will deliver audience engagement. And that's the goal. That's the part of the process that may lead to changes in clinical practice and ultimately better health outcomes for patients, which is what we're all concerned, is why we're all here in this industry. You know, I was at a conference last week about medical affairs strategy, and one of the presenters made a really good point about what is essential to get right in omni-channel engagement. And that is, once the strategic objective is defined, you really need to identify the right audience, the right content, the right channel, and the right format, which is going to deliver the personalized experience. That's what it's all about. We were talking earlier about, you know, when someone's traveling to work, when they want to listen to a podcast, it's very personalized. Or if they're a little bit more, I mentioned earlier, if they are, you know, very interested in a particular field, such as AI, we make it more personalized, and that's going to engage them, and that's what it's all about. And that's really what's going to move the needle. Not just getting the information out there, but really getting it so it's personalized to them. That's going to have them think about whether it's anything from guidelines to changes in their behavior. That's what we're all concerned about, and that's what our goal is. And then finally, of course, you want to get right the outcomes are, and that's through metrics. And we probably talk about that a little bit during the Q&A. But you have to make sure that the approach you're using is right on target, and you can do that through various metrics and the outcomes. You know, finally, if we're talking about, again, I want to stress, if we're talking about a global omni-channel engagement, the approach in different countries is certainly not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. HCPs in the US, Brazil, China, for example, they all have very different content consumption preferences. So in the end, really, why would the formats within these channels be any different? So to deliver successful engagement campaigns, like the examples that Johnny and Todd shared earlier, you need to factor in omni-format into your strategy, and that's really just the it's essential. So I don't know, Johnny, you may have some final words.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I wanted to touch on one final thought, actually, regarding audiences, whether that's a clinical audience or a patient audience. And as you said, Neil, an omni-format approach is essential to gaining a wider audience with different learning styles. And I'm sure that most of us attending today, listening in, watching today, are aware of the importance of reporting back metrics to assess how an educational campaign has performed. However, sometimes, and I can be guilty of this as well, sometimes we can be too caught up in seeking big engagement numbers without thinking about the quality of that audience. Having a big number on your metrics spreadsheet may seem impressive at first glance, but how can we ensure the content was relevant and properly understood by all those learners? And I think it's important to consider that a highly engaged, a higher quality, but perhaps smaller audience will have more of an impact on clinical and patient educational outcomes. For example, working directly with patient groups, like I mentioned with the WM example, or even professional societies, no matter how big or how small they may be, to develop, endorse, and distribute content guarantees a highly relevant audience, okay, who will engage with the content in a meaningful way. And at the end of the day, put what they have learned into practice. So as a closing thought, next time you're seeking to publish and distribute content, I think it's very important to consider the quality of your audience, sometimes over the quantity of your audience. And I'm sure some of those results will speak for themselves. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think both your points, right? One size doesn't fit all, but also, you know, consider quality versus quantity. Both very important points to note and to take with us. And I think so, as we are actually approaching the end of this part of the webinar, we may want to conclude with some key takeaways. I think firstly, it's important to consider those highly individual learning patterns, right? When designing and distributing in scientific or medical information. Secondly, acknowledge or recognize the individual life situations of your audiences, be it patients and or healthcare professionals, that may limit their ability to consume information. And last but not least, finally, whenever possible, try and integrate an omni-format approach to reach a wider audience. And with that, I'm happy to hand back to you, Arsalan, and open the floor for questions.
All right, thank you so much, Iola, and the entire panel. It's a very informative and very nice presentation. And we've got several questions from the audience. So let's get started. I noticed you had mentioned it a little bit during the presentation, but perhaps we could go a little bit deeper into it over here. The question from the audience is, do you foresee there being significant differences between the consumption preferences of HCPs from different specialties? For example, a neurologist and a hematologist. So for the panel, have you seen certain types of consumption preferences for different types of specialties that seem to work out best? What's your take on that?
So internally, I have team members who focus on audience insights, so they can speak to this in much greater depth than I could off the top of my head. But I will say, yes, there is significant variability from specialty to specialty, and it's critical to dig into the data that you have. And when you look at syndicated data, it very quickly allows you to look at different segments by specialty, and then you can segment data within that. You'll start seeing certain things rise in certain channels. Maybe it's social media will have a greater relevance for some audiences, visual channels for others. It's looking a little specialty on where they're going, you know, thinking through their lens. And if they're going to Doximity or Sermo, a closed platform, what are the vehicles, the formats available within those channels? So we just got to think a little bit more about where they're going, what do they trust? And it's not what do we trust. I think I'm seeing a number of questions that are getting into the I don't trust channel X. That's not as important as where are the physicians going? What are they seeking as their credible sources? You know, a lot of people are talking about, well, you know, can Twitter be taken seriously? There are physicians who are attending tutorials and going through that on a regular basis because they found physicians or digital opinion leaders that they trust, that they continue to go back to for information. So whether you're there or not, whether you have concerns or not, doesn't mean that your audience may not be leveraging that channel. And that's the thing we've really got to be thinking through, their lens, not our own.
Perfect. Well, for transparency, let me read a couple of those questions that you're referring to, Todd, over there, because we could segue into that. So let me just read the questions and we could talk about it. One of the questions, there's several over here, but let me read it for the audience. Given the advent of fake news, how do we ensure that blogs and even Twitter are considered seriously? And another question is, what is the panel's opinion on the use of Twitter going forward? Risk of the daily schizophrenic changes, actors, do you see a favorite replacement platform emerging that is more stable. So Todd, what I understood, what you just said was quite a few of those HCPs are actually on Twitter, and they're checking out those things. And so it actually doesn't necessarily matter what the perception of Twitter as a whole is for general audiences in general. You find actually quite a few of these healthcare, these doctors that are actually on there engaging with other doctors, engaging with academics, engaging with the whole ecosystem out there. And they, certain ones will find it credible in terms of the people they are following on those platforms, not necessarily the sort of general memes that are being shared at the top level on these platforms. Is that right?
Yeah, and I would say as scientific communication professionals, our goal is to make sure that there's great content out there. So if there are channels in which there is dialogue occurring, I think it's important to be contributing to that, to help ensuring great content, accurate, valid information is available to those audiences so that they aren't going to those channels in the absence of great content.
Right.
If I could
Please.
add to that, about the Twitter. Yeah, one of the DOLs that I follow is Eric Topol at the Cleveland Clinic. He is terrific, and he is got to be one of the most active physicians out there who is tweeting, particularly during COVID. And there's a lot of really good, relevant, important information, thanks to Dr. Topol and all that he was doing. And I think it had a lot of effect on all the other folks during COVID. Because as I say, he's someone that is a KOL that a lot of cardiologists and others look up to, and as I say, very, very active, very important to have his voice there. So I think, again, to Todd's point, it really is who is using it and the important messages that they're sending. And as I say, there are some really important ones out there, so I would not discontinue it, and I would be very, very careful about disregarding some important some doctors, because they do very good work and they promote it on Twitter, and they help to educate.
I'd like to weigh in as well, actually, if I may. I don't want to spend too long on this question, but I think it's an interesting one. I think that Twitter can be a very useful tool for reaching a very wide audience. There are millions of people on Twitter. Do I think it's a great place to get your medical information from the source? Maybe not always. Sometimes, yes, possibly. However, I think that it's a great, let's call it a disseminator of information which actually is very scientifically sound. Someone mentioned blogs as well. We've got, I mean, just speaking from experience, we run a very popular patient blog, and we use Twitter and certain healthcare professionals who are fairly influential on Twitter to draw attention to that. And I think that using Twitter as an audience generation tool can be very, very valuable. But I think that maybe having some sound scientific content, maybe on another platform which is just being communicated via Twitter, might be a safer way to go to avoid this fake news, these bad actors that the person who asked the question mentioned. So I just wanted to weigh in on that and drop that one in there.
Wonderful. On that note, in terms of the veracity of the information that we find on these different platforms over there, how do you view the different platforms that are out there? Like we've just talked about Twitter a little bit, and Neil, you mentioned Topol, who's out there, who I think all of us know who he is, and we follow him, and we see the great work he does. He has got a Substack right now, so we're talking about the blogs and the different sort of ways that people will go out and reach their audiences in a direct sort of way. How are you all thinking about TikTok, for example? Can you talk about a little bit about that? How do you evaluate these things when they're coming out and these new channels are coming out and they seem to be taking over the conversation? How would you evaluate a channel like that?
So I'll quickly get out over my skis on this one when it comes to TikTok. But as an example, there's a lot of emerging channels that come out. And what we do is we look at the data. Again, that syndicated data is assessing where are physicians going. And as you see certain pieces jumping up, see a 20 to 30% increase year over year on the use of a certain channel, that's something you need to be looking at. But there's some channels that come out and over time, they may not increase. Yeah, they may be new and splashy and have broader visibility, But when physicians are asked, where are you going for information, that may not rise in their particular perspective. So it's always digging into the data to see where we can go or where we should be, and then using that and figuring out, yeah, here's an emerging platform. We are seeing this increase. Maybe we want to pilot something in here to see whether it's effective, but med legal, there would be a lot of med legal discussions involved in piloting something for a very novel channel as well.
Okay. Question from the audience here that we could segue into. So how does one get the data of what platforms HCPs and healthcare communities are primarily using? How do we know what they're doing?
So I've mentioned syndicated data a couple of times. There are great resources out there that you can leverage and pull the information, and you have to pay for access to the data. But there's also your internal stakeholders in companies. There's people who are already interacting and know from 20 years of experience of working with this population, this is where they go. This is what they trust. So I think it's taking those different pieces and pulling them together to get a more complete story. And then at times you say, well, yes, I understand on one particular audience, but for the community oncs, I still have certain gaps on pieces. Well, then you can conduct primary research and get the answers, reach out and get that information. You can say, hey, field medical, when you're in the field, I want to understand this. Could you help us get a better reading on these particular channels? So I think it's just putting a program in place to make sure you've got the information coming in. And then it's incumbent upon us to comb through that and then determine how we best action the information.
Yep.
Yeah, I think from a publisher's perspective, maybe I can add to that, right? Having a long heritage in the publishing sphere, right, and brings us with a lot of connections to experts, right? We are connected with different key opinion leaders globally, from editorial editors-in-chief to editorial board members, but also, you know, HCPs and even patient advocacy groups where we can conduct you know, you can conduct a desk research, but you can really engage with those people, asking those questions and gaining as many insights as possible to then identify where they are and where they tend to go to and how to then target those channels effectively.
Okay. Wonderful. We have a couple questions here that relates to effectiveness and metrics. So let me read one of them over here, and we could see it. So one of the questions says, how can one start small with omni-channel before investing large amounts into developing an entire suite? But let me also ask a similar question, was just how do you measure the effectiveness of your formats? If we were to go off doing this, how can I take this? We all have superiors. How do I take what we've done, what we've invested in, and take it over to someone in a one-pager or a report and justify to my superior what we've done and how effective this is?
Yeah, I'll start. It's an excellent question, and it's really a challenge that has been around for a while. Again, I mentioned a conference I was at last week, and in fact, Todd and I were at a conference. He mentioned at this ISMAP meeting even before then, and at both of these conferences, that exact question came up. So appreciate whoever submitted that. It's something that's most definitely on the discussion front these days. And it's a tricky, it's kind of a tricky answer because you have, of course, your quantitative metrics and you have your qualitative metrics. And the quantitative metrics are easier, in my opinion, easier to obtain than the qualitative metrics. When we're talking quantitative, you're talking about how many publications have been published, how many views in YouTube, how many times something has been downloaded. These are just numbers that we can produce, and Karger can produce it very well, and we can give you these quantitative data to help show you that you're gaining some traction with whatever this part of this omni-channel journey that you're on. The problem though comes perhaps with the qualitative metrics, is how much you have these numbers that people are looking at this video, but how much is that actually changing their behavior? the physician's behavior, or even getting to the patients and changing what they're sort of looking at. The qualitative metrics are something you would normally find in something like a survey, for example. And we've done things, Carter has done things like e-learning programs, accredited, CME programs. And so we can, at the end of the program, this e-learning program, we do surveys and we ask questions about, you've done this program for an hour now, and you've answered all these questions and you've watched all these presenters. Do you think that is actually going to change your practice, the way you how you treat patients? And fortunately, the ones we've done, a lot of them had said yes. The information that I have gathered from this program, I'm going to take to my practice and help my patients. And I think this has been very helpful and very educational. That's coming through a survey, which is easy to do when you're doing something like an e-learning program. It's harder to do when you're just, you're doing the things we talked about earlier about the different formats with videos or podcasts or in summary sheets. So it is a challenge. Surveys are important in terms of the qualitative metrics. There are other insights that you could gain from discussions with maybe the MSLs or talking with the healthcare providers and taking back some information. So insights are important, can give you some clue as to the qualitative result of these things. But it's really, again, quantitative is a little easier. Qualitative is emerging. I think we'll get to the point where we'll be able to provide better data in terms of qualitative metrics, hopefully fairly soon.
And following up on what Neil was saying, you have to remember omni-channel planning in general is very new to medical affairs. We're not talking about something that's been done for a very long period of time. Outside other fields, yes. So we're still finding our way in a lot of ways when it comes to metrics. And a lot of the programs today are focused on more of the tactical elements, clicks, views, et cetera. But I'm excited to see more and more robust discussions around the surveys, knowledge, education. Are we seeing learning? Because that's really what we care about. I'm less concerned if somebody looked at something as to whether they took the content that we put in there for them. So I'm excited to see that these types of discussions are ongoing and can't wait to see where we are 2 to 3 years from now.
Okay. Let's get to a couple more questions here with the time that we have remaining. A question here from the audience is, how are patient advocacy groups or professional societies engaged to help develop content? Do you guys have a playbook for that?
Yeah, I think that's something that I could speak to. It's very much within, I think, the interest of a patient advocacy group to partner with, let's say, I can only speak from my own experience, working for a medical publisher, but I think it's really within their interest to partner with a group like ours or others that are out there, because, although they do have, they are experts by experience, right? These are patients who are suffering from X disease. They may have been through quite a long journey already, and they know quite a lot about the ins and the outs of, for example, how to interact with your doctor or what lifestyle changes to expect. But really, the advocacy group themselves don't really have the means to be able to publish in the way that, for example, a professional publisher or medcoms agency might. So I think it's within their interest to do that, but I think it's also within the interest of, let's say, a pharma company who's looking to increase patient knowledge on a certain disease, to work closely with that advocacy group and not just give them information which the pharma company wants them to know or the publisher wants them to know, but actually information which the patients themselves want to know. And I think it's incredibly important to involve them at a very early stage, literally from the content creation point of view. Personally, I've done this many times with patient advocacy groups, and it really empowers patients as well, to be involved in something like this, and not to have something spat at them saying, okay, this is what you need to know, but really ask the question, what do I want to know, right? And then work with them closely on that to develop something which is a lot more hard-hitting and a lot more impactful, shall we say, and a lot more useful to them. I think the same thing goes with the professional society too. They have the network as well. Let's talk about their audiences, right? We're talking about the quality of an audience versus a quantity. Well, if we can produce something in conjunction with an advocacy group or a professional society, they've got the network, you know, we've got the publishing expertise, let's say, and so it can really come together as quite a harmonious relationship, a symbiotic, mutually beneficial relationship between us. So that's what I wanted to say on that. I'd love to hear if anyone else has got, you know, something to add, but yeah.
All right. So the publishers are doing what the publishers ought to do. Sorry, Iola.
No, go ahead. I just wanted to second what Johnny said, because yeah, for the society side, I think it's pretty similar to patient advocacy groups or any other community, if you will, right? In the end, it's about bringing both sides together. As a publisher, of course, we have that opportunity. So yeah.
Great. Well, then for our last question, let's stick to something very publisher centric here, because the question from the audience is, we've talked about lots of different formats and whatnot, but I think the question from the audience is, what format is currently used more in the US for HCPs and for patients, right? I know we've talked about lots of different formats, and probably there's a longer answer that you might want to give for something like this, but a general response to this from the panel, please.
So, sorry, Johnny, I'll just jump in quick. From an enhanced content perspective, there's a lot of emerging research coming out. That's why I love going to the conferences to see what are the assessments, what are the data that people are pulling together, how do we learn from that? Because as I mentioned earlier, this is still a field in its infancy. We don't have the ROI for everything today, but different people are building that. The publishers are coming together with different companies to say, how do we make this more accessible? How do we really see and demonstrate the value of the enhanced content? And we're seeing certain types, you know, visual abstract is a very relatively straightforward piece that is accessible, that can be pushed out. Plain language summary is another one. Those are ones that have received a lot of positive sentiment, but maybe Neil or Johnny, y'all would have more depth on this one.
Yeah, I'd just make a comment about the visual abstracts, because we do a lot, just speaking for publisher, for Karger, we do a lot of visual abstracts at Karger. And those, again, I've worked with some industry sponsors of research, and they want the visual abstract to be a part of the publication. And it's good because it can do any format. You could really do the print as well as the electronic. And it's very easy to of course, to tweet a visual abstract. So electronic, but it really fills both. So it's very popular with us, but as Todd said, there are a lot of other things that are getting more traction these days. But that's just one example of what we've been doing a lot of at Karger.
Okay. Well, Iola Forster, Jonathan Gifford, Neil Adams, and Todd Parker, it's been a pleasure. That's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank everyone in the audience for also tuning in, and we appreciate Karger Publishers for sponsoring this discussion at Endpoints Webinars. If you'd like to rewatch this webinar or to share it with your colleagues, a link for on-demand viewing will be sent. I'm Arslan Arif for Endpoints News. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you at a future Endpoints event. Thanks, everybody.